In the years after the war, these statistics were compiled for the dental service. During the period January 1st, 1942 to August 31st, 1945, the Army Dental Corps completed the following procedures: 16,231,264 extractions, 69,546,560 restorations, 579,473 full dentures, and 2,032,684 partial dentures. 20 dental officers were killed by enemy action. In addition to these 20, 5 later succumbed to their wounds, 10 died in captivity, and 81 lost their lives to disease and non-battle injury. Over 18,000 dentists served during World War II, with 7,103 of these seeing service overseas. These are some astonishing, though often unrecognized, contributions to the overall war effort. One can only speculate on how the professional skill of the dentists serving in the military impacted the ability of the ordinary GI to fight the war, especially since the strong nexus between oral and overall physical health has been well established. At the time of the Japanese capitulation, planning was underway for the Allied invasion of Japan. Those plans quickly changed from military invasion to peaceful occupation. Japan had agreed to the terms of surrender, but how could we be sure they would comply with those terms? A line from an Army report read, "A conquered people does not necessarily have a conquered spirit." It further indicated that it was assumed that the Japanese would not wholly comply with the details of the surrender terms. A decision was made to allow the emperor to retain his throne. On September 3, 1945, the day after Japan's formal surrender, the Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, issued Directive No. 2, which imposed on the Japanese government the basic requirement for prompt execution of the terms of surrender. The Japanese government would shoulder the administrative and operational burden of disarmament and demobilization. They would also be responsible to transition the government to a democracy, which included the loosening of restrictions on the civilian population and the selection of governing officials through means of elections. There were a host of other actions that needed to be taken, including repatriation of foreign nationals, recovery of Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees, and conversion of war industries to peacetime production. To oversee their actions, the Allies would install an army of occupation. The 24th Infantry Division, which included the 21st Infantry Regiment, was selected to be part of it. This force would have to adapt from its former combat-oriented mission to its new mission of supervising Japan's treaty obligations. This photo of women golfers receiving prizes at a dinner party appeared in the Evening News of Harrisburg on October 13, 1945. Appearing second from the right is my wife, Wilma Rhein, who 3 days later would be celebrating her 37th birthday without me. For the wives of soldiers serving overseas, life went on. Though the war was over, I was still on the Philippine island of Mindanao, making last-minute preparations for the October 15th departure by ship convoy with the 24th Infantry Division for occupation duty in Japan. At this point, neither of us knew how long it would be before I would return home. On October 15, 1945, troops of the 24th Division, including the 21st Infantry Regiment, departed Mindanao on the voyage for Japan, where it would be tasked with occupation duties. This photo was taken as the ships sailed out of the Davao Gulf. We wanted to go home. We felt we had done our share, but we had no choice but to wait a little longer. Lots of things went through our minds, not the least of which was the kind of reception we might receive from the people of Japan, who had been until recently our enemy. In his book, Jungle, Sea, and Occupation, Paul Vetch wrote, "Our officers were not convinced that our mission would be entirely peaceful, and we had no intention of being caught unprepared." Here's a scene of the ocean from our convoy heading north to Japan. The sky is cloudy and there is a dark storm cloud, but if you look closely, you can see the faint appearance of a rainbow in the distance. The rainbow, a sign of divine covenant. In the upper foreground, a break in the clouds reveals the blue sky beyond. To my eye as a soldier, the symbolism of this scene was loud and clear. Light was breaking through the darkness, and peace was returning. After 7 days at sea, we arrived off the coast of Japan on October 22nd. At this point, the danger of mines still existed in many Japanese ports and waterways. Some of them had been placed there by Allied aircraft prior to the Japanese surrender. This threat affected the routing and debarkation locations of arriving occupation forces. We were directed to enter the Seto Inland Sea and debark at the Hiro Naval Air Station near the city of Kure. From there, we dispatched reconnaissance parties to Yanago and the city of Tottori in the Tottori Prefecture. Most of our regiment traveled by trucks along the coastal road, the 50 miles to our assigned base at the inland port of Okayama in the Okayama Prefecture. Our 2nd Battalion was assigned to the town of Matsui, with Company G at Tottori and H at Yonago. Our trip through the Seto Inland Sea was a pleasant one, although as seasoned soldiers, we had learned to take nothing for granted. Peaceful scenes like this one made us wonder how much these people had even known about the war. We passed a number of port communities on our way to Okayama. Here you can catch a glimpse of the terraced farming on the hillside above this peaceful-looking town. Upon our arrival in Okayama, we were directed to this gated compound, which would become our base while in Japan. As I mentioned before, Okayama was located in the Okayama Prefecture. A prefecture in Japan was a governing jurisdiction similar to a state in the United States. Under the occupation plan, a regiment was assigned to each prefecture. Our regiment had responsibility for 2 prefectures, Okayama and Tottori, since there were more than 3 prefectures assigned to our division area. The entire plan for the imposition of the terms of surrender was based upon the presence of infantry regiments in all prefectures within the Japanese homeland. Each regiment supervised the implementation of the terms of surrender within its zone. The demobilization of the Japanese army stationed within the Japanese homeland proceeded very quickly. By November 3rd, 97% of Japanese troops had been demobilized and sent home. Those remaining were needed to carry out the discharge of troops still returning from overseas locations. This is a street scene from a poor section of Shimatsu, a neighborhood of Okayama. Notice the man wearing some of his military uniform clothing. One of the most difficult tasks of the occupation force was locating, seizing, guarding, and disposing of surrendered Japanese, and even some German, equipment and material. The Japanese army was directed to disarm all Japanese forces and to hold and deliver all weapons and equipment at times and places specified by occupation forces and to submit detailed inventories. I should note that directives required that the Japanese were responsible for translating all documentation, including these inventories, into English. Language detachments of the occupation forces, made up of Americans of Japanese descent, were responsible for verifying the accuracy of these translations. All equipment deemed not suitable for peacetime use was to be destroyed. Equipment suitable for peacetime use was to be disposed of at the discretion of the local commander. The presence of mines in most harbors made dumping the material at sea difficult. This is a scene taken in the city of Nara. One of the regiment's major activities was to maintain continuous military patrols and intelligence measures to keep a constant check on all activities within the area of responsibility. Patrols conducted investigations and reported findings. Here are some examples of the activities and issues discovered. The hiding of clothing and food, illegal selling of Japanese Army and Navy supplies, illegal disposal of Japanese military goods, trading of goods for American military gear, such as binoculars and field telephones, hoarding of supplies in secret warehouses, clothing, blankets, signal equipment, etc., stealing foodstuffs from U.S. Army kitchens to sell for money. Patrols inspected former war industry plants, production of arms, ammunition, implements of war and parts and components was prohibited, as well as combat vessels and all types of aircraft. All production efforts were to be diverted to peace and had to be approved by permit application to occupation commanders. Our patrols disrupted petroleum black market operations. They investigated work strikes involving wages and food rationing, and officials for diverting food supplies for their own use. They collected unauthorized arms by civilians, specifically 100 pistols, 2,000 rifles and shotguns, 10,000 swords, sabers and spears, 300 bayonets, 17 machine guns, a few hand grenades, and 100 mortar and artillery shells, along with small arms ammunition. The regiment provided guards for train transportation of foreign nationals being repatriated to their countries of origin to ensure they behaved properly in transit and ensure they detrained only at specific locations en route to the separation centers. There were 1 million Koreans, 30,000 Chinese, 19,000 Formosans, and 2,000 European nationals, mostly Germans, requiring repatriation. The burden of repatriation was placed on the Japanese government. Complete compliance with both the letter and spirit of the surrender agreement was beyond a reasonable expectation. Therefore, in addition to actions being taken at the regimental level, Army counterintelligence was given the mission of close surveillance throughout the entire occupation zone for evidence of evasion or avoidance of the surrender terms. Their task was to prevent hostile acts and movements detrimental to the interests of Allied forces before they could accomplish their purpose. They investigated to ensure that municipal police chiefs were removed from office and replaced in accordance with directives. They investigated police records to ensure that political prisoners had been released. They investigated to ensure the former members of the now dissolved Kempai Tai military police and Toko-Ka thought police had not gone underground and that organization records had been secured. They established informal networks to keep a close check on Japanese attitudes and their reaction to the occupation as it proceeded. They were also charged with determining the extent of compliance with an order of October 4, 1945, entitled Removal of Restrictions on Political, Civil, and Religious Liberties. They uncovered several large stashes of arms and ammunition. They surveyed school curriculum to determine the extent democratic and liberal ideas were included. They found evidence of failure to report to the Allies locations of all gold, silver, and other precious metals. They uncovered a supply of radium in the German consulate. They investigated the activity of the Nazi Party in Japan. There was a large German colony in Kobe. They confiscated film, records, and documents. They investigated ultra-nationalistic, imperialistic, and militaristic organizations for subversive potential. Most of these organizations claim to have disbanded and destroyed their records after the surrender. Of course, I was not directly involved in any of the occupation activities previously mentioned. However, indirectly, if I became aware of any activities that violated the terms of surrender, I was required to report them. My role during the occupation was to provide routine dental care for the regiment. As you can see from this photo, in the Army, sometimes the dentist has to go where the patients are. In this case, the chow line at the barracks in Okayama. This ensured that the checkups were short, otherwise the GIs would miss chow. If any issues were found, it was noted, and they were addressed at a follow-up appointment. In the course of my work and my time in Japan, I was fortunate to make the acquaintance of some very fine Japanese people. This is Dr. Yagi and family. He was head director and chief surgeon at the Okayama Hospital and became a great friend of mine. I was able to take my patients to his hospital and x-ray their teeth. This happened on a daily basis. After the war, Dr. Yagi visited our home in Harrisburg when he was in the United States attending medical clinics. Later, he was attending seminars at the Mayo Clinic Hospital in the United States, and he called me by phone. Unfortunately, time did not permit our meeting again. Sometime later, he passed away at the age of 85. Here are some other fine Japanese people I met through my work. They are X-ray technicians at the Okayama City Hospital who developed our dental X-rays for us. I was able to arrange flights to travel to various locations around Honshu. The flights gave me the opportunity to get a bird's eye view of the Japanese terrain and record some photographs. Here I am at the Army Airfield in Okayama, about to board one of our Division Artillery two-seater spotter planes for a flight. This is one of my photos from the spotter plane. Here is another shot showing the terraced farming the Japanese were known for. This photo is of the home and private museum of Mr. Soichiro Ohara, located in Kurashiki, Shimatsu, Japan. Why is Mr. Ohara's home and museum so significant to show here? I met this gentleman while in Japan, and he was most gracious to me. Mr. Ohara was greatly interested in natural history and fortunately very wealthy, possessing great influence in Japan. The Ohara family might have been comparable to the Vanderbilts in the United States. Mr. Ohara was in the forefront of promoting aeronautics in Japan and sponsored its manufacture and growth, especially during peace times. Years before the Second World War, Mr. Ohara and his wife visited the United States during their honeymoon. His main purpose was to see the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary near Hamburg, Pennsylvania, and observe flight patterns of birds of prey in our country. Mr. Maurice Brune, the curator, was delighted. In his book, Hawks Aloft, Brune includes this description of the encounter. Quote, "In the late fall of 1946, Dr. William Rhein and Robert Troxell, both of Harrisburg, turned up at the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary after an absence of 4 years. Both had been in service in Japan in the earlier part of that year. and had there met a Japanese friend of Hawk Mountain. When they told me his name, I well remembered how one day in October 1937, there had appeared at the lookout an impressively tall Japanese, Soichiro Ohara, and his petite wife, both of Kurashiki. They were on their honeymoon, and their steamer had scarcely arrived at New York when they engaged a taxi and started for Hawk Mountain. It had been raining, and the mountain road was muddy. The taxi driver, fearful of getting stuck along the road, would not drive to the gate. After parking the car a half-mile or more below the entrance, his passengers tramped the remainder of the way. Mrs. Ohara had her little shoes strapped securely to her ankles, using her silk stockings as straps. Unfortunately, they struck a poor flight day, but the Oharas saw a few ospreys, some red tails, and a marsh hawk, and they were profoundly impressed with the scenery, which they compared to a certain locality in Japan. Curiously enough, both Dr. Rhein and Bob Troxell had independently the good fortune to meet Ohara, a conservationist who maintains a private experimental station, the Ohara Institute of Kurashiki, where he has plant pathologists, entomologists, plant breeders, and agronomists in his employ. It is the only institute of its kind in Japan. Imagine their surprise and pleasure when Ohara told these men that he had visited Hawk Mountain." End quote. Brune and Ohara were able to get together on follow-up flights both in the United States and Japan. Mr. Ohara was a great traveler, collecting many natural history specimens worldwide. My pictures of Ohara and his museum I unfortunately gave to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, who I feel are sitting upon them without any significance. This is another view of the Ohara home. Mr. Ohara showed us his museum and gave us a banquet at his home. He also took us on an overnight boat ride down one of the rivers on which we were introduced to a number of other prominent persons. This was a very enjoyable and memorable experience. On the left is a photo of me with my Army dental assistant, Ted Woodarski, taken in Japan. He's also shown on the right. I served with Ted throughout the war. At this point in my story, I'd like to mention some other issues the Army was facing during the occupation. The first issue was that of reassignment of troops back to the States, in other words, releasing them from the Army. It was difficult for the Army to maintain the morale of troops who had served throughout the war and were now being kept in Japan on occupation duty. To its credit, the Army tried a lot of things. It built theaters, broadcast Armed Forces radio programs on WLKH, and established athletic competitions and recreational opportunities. There were officer and enlisted men's clubs. A library was established. A riding stable set up. A GI college started, and even an outdoor swimming pool built. Training programs were conducted to maintain combat skills and efficiency. The Army bent over backwards to improve the morale of the soldiers. During the occupation period, the Army underwent continuous realignment within its organization. Part of this involved deactivation of units no longer deemed needed. In some cases, units were moved and attached to other commands. All of this was done in an effort to improve operating efficiency. Also, replacements were continuously being received to fill vacancies created as some soldiers were sent home. Here are two photos of me in Okayama. My lack of military bearing at this stage of my time in the service is evident, as I stand with hands in pockets. It would be a good bet if you were thinking that my morale was suffering as the days passed on occupation duty in Japan. I was ready to return to the States. My adjusted service rating score was 61, 6 points higher than the 55 threshold number for a dental officer. I was eligible for demobilization back to the States and discharge, but I was being held as part of the Army of Occupation. Then good news finally came in the form of Army Department Circular 57, which permitted the reassignment of personnel of the service who lost members of their families while serving in the armed forces. I had lost my dad in January of 1945 and therefore was immediately eligible to return home. I would be leaving Japan for good in the spring of 1946. This photo was taken in Okayama in 1946. These two-wheeled carts are called jinrickshaws, literally man-powered carts. They operate like taxis, seen here lined up waiting for customers. I thoroughly enjoyed this leisurely ride in the jinrickshaw. It was a beautiful spring day, April 1946, with the cherry blossoms in bloom. I especially enjoyed this ride because by now I had received my orders and would soon be leaving for home. It is a little tough to see, but if you look closely, you can see the taro leaf 24th Division patch on the left sleeve of my uniform. On May 19, 1946, I stepped onto the gangway of the ship that would take me home. I had taken my last step on Japanese soil. As the ship carried me homeward, I looked west to see this final sunset on Japan with Mount Fuji visible in the far distance. The sun was also setting on my time as a soldier in an army at war. The story of my journey through the islands of the Pacific during World War II was a fascinating one. The risk of serious injury and death posed by the enemy, disease, and accidents was ever present. For my service to the country, the Army rewarded me with the following decorations: the Bronze Star Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, the Army of Occupation Medal, the World War II Victory Medal, and the Philippine Liberation Medal. I was also authorized to wear the Combat Infantryman's Badge as a bona fide combat veteran. This odyssey, which spanned from August 30th, 1943 to my official discharge on September 7th, 1946, covered more territory than most people travel in a lifetime. It began in some extremely primitive cultures and would end in one of the more sophisticated cultures on Earth. The sights and experiences of that journey would dramatically shape my thinking, propel my future adventures, and remain with me throughout my life.